you very much, Yadvinder. So it's great. This is sort of the end of a very stimulating week here at Oxford, and it's great to see lots of friends, some old, some new, various academic people in the community, and some of the NGO world, and then some people that like Ben Flyberg, who I've known of for many years, but have wanted to meet, and I finally get a chance to meet him now. But so this is sort of the culmination of, it's been quite a big week here at Oxford. There was a conference this week, if you didn't hear about it, called Conservation Geopolitics. And I thought, even though I live in Australia, I was like, I'm going to that. That just sounds too interesting to miss. And it was a very stimulating week. I gave a version of this talk. It was actually, it's nice to have a little more relaxed venue, because now I get to try to cram a 90-minute talk into 50 minutes rather than a 90-minute talk into 30 minutes, which is what I had to do for the last conference. But anyway, this is obviously focusing on infrastructure, and what I'm going to try to do is to put it a little bit in the prism of this extremely rare species of ape, the most critically endangered species of great ape on the planet. Largely because we've all heard about infrastructure, and you can't pick up a newspaper or go online or read anything or see anything without hearing, about infrastructure issues. I mean, they've really emerged, in addition to sort of climate change, as one of the great environmental, ecological transformation issues, and also, one would have to say, economic and social and all those other issues that go along with it. Tremendously transformative kinds of issues that are happening on the planet today. And I'm actually going to argue and try to make the case that I think that if you had to put your finger on one proximate issue, now we all know that in terms of, say, changes that are happening on the Earth, things like human population increase and high consumption and climate change would be very important, fundamental drivers, ultimate drivers. But in terms of what's really happening on the ground, I think this tsunami of infrastructure that we're seeing right now is, in the next few decades, is probably going to change the world more dramatically than just about anything that we could talk about. And I would say, without any reservation, it'll be more dramatic than climate change, because it's facilitating climate change perhaps longer term, but this is just transforming everything just about everywhere we look. And more about why I think that argument can be justified. I'm going to talk a lot about roads, but when we talk about infrastructure, really we mean all kinds of infrastructure. So we mean energy infrastructure, such as hydroelectric dams, which is something, for instance, that Flyberg has worked on a great deal. We mean water infrastructure, we mean transportation infrastructure, we mean all those different kinds of projects, and including also oftentimes extractive industries, which are closely allied with many of these projects. I tend to talk about roads a fair bit because in many ways they're kind of a common denominator. And we're looking at an era of incredible road expansion in our lifetimes. For instance, the International Energy Agency suggests that we're going to have something like 25 million kilometers of new paved roads. Now, it doesn't include all the unpaved roads. 25 million kilometers of new paved roads by the middle part of the century, enough to encircle the world more than 600 times. But one of the reasons why, firstly, it's difficult to separate out different kinds of infrastructure from each other. You have to talk about infrastructure in a sense because it's very associated, but also the other reason that roads become such a common denominator is it's very difficult, effectively impossible, to do many kinds of the projects that are happening right now, whether you're talking about a big mining project or a hydroelectric dam or oil and gas project or timber project or other kinds of extractive industry or other kinds of development without roads. I mean, imagine trying to construct a hydroelectric dam, which involves thousands, millions of tons of concrete and other heavy equipment and all that type of thing, and building a project like that out in some area without having roads. And of course, you absolutely have to have roads for the construction and the maintenance, and also for linear clearings, also associated for the high tension power lines that would be coming away from that. And this just gives you an example here. There's over 300 hydroelectric dams of significant size, varying sizes, that are currently being planned or underway in the Amazon basin, in the tributaries of the Amazon, and also in the Andes and the Andean Piedmont that are contributing into the Amazon. And these are going to be, in many cases, extremely transformative because a lot of these occur in remote areas, and you're simply going to have road networks that connect those hydro dams to, centers of where you're going to be transporting all of these construction materials and that type of thing. And they tend to have, we oftentimes tend to refer to the project that would provide the economic impetus for road building. So this might be a big hydro dam, or it might be a large mining project as an anchoring project. Okay, so for example, a hydro dam might be a major anchoring project, and then that will oftentimes require and also drag a lot of infrastructure and a lot of roads or railways or other kinds of projects with it. Now this is just an example here. Here's the Tucuruí Dam in Brazil. When this project was first initiated, this was mostly forest. There were some local indigenous populations, but it was a very, very sparsely populated area, mostly forested. And you can see here's the footprint of the dam right now, and you can see all the incredible development that's now happened around that dam. So this is kind of the reality of what happens in frontier areas with many of these kinds of projects. Yes, you get the direct impact of the project, but in fact, it's oftentimes that associated effect of all that transportation infrastructure, especially roads, sometimes railroads, and sometimes waterways, but roads being overwhelmingly the most common thing, that is just so transformative, and it just changes everything. So there's really a reason why I tend to sort of carp on endlessly about roads and their environmental effects. Another important thing to emphasize is that, of course, developing countries are developing, and developing countries very much need development. And about 9/10 of all the infrastructure expansion happening right now is occurring in developing countries. And I think if you're going to be part of the conversation about what's happening in developing nations, I personally think you've got to say two things right up front, very emphatically. Number one, developing countries need economic and social development. There's just no way you can be part of any kind of rational conversation without it right away saying that. The second thing is that these are sovereign nations, and they've got an absolute right to make whatever decisions that they want about their own development trajectories. Okay, now I think if you deviate from either one of those kinds of fundamental assumptions, you immediately run into some very serious trouble, some problems. So I think by starting with those assumptions, then what we're interested in doing is essentially providing the best information to try to help decision makers and other parties to make the best decisions about development in those kinds of countries that are undergoing incredible transformation, and it's sweeping across every aspect of their lives: the economic, financial, political, social, environmental. I mean, every aspect of their environment in the very large sense are being transformed in many cases by this tsunami of infrastructure projects. And this is just an example. The Congo Basin, I grew up sort of thinking of the Congo as sort of one of the world's great wild areas. Read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. In fact, if you look at the Congo today, well, in fact, this study is a bit dated. This is a study by Nadine Laporte, study and colleagues published in Science a little more than a decade ago. They found that there had been an incredible proliferation of roads in the Congo Basin on the order of about 50,000 kilometers over the 10 years preceding that study. And even if you then zoomed in and you looked at some places like that don't seem to have very many roads, if you use high resolution techniques and you zoom in even further, you could actually see that there are in many cases logging roads that you just don't pick up without these higher resolution techniques. So an incredible proliferation of roads. In fact, working with Nadine, we've just repeated that study, and we've replicated it exactly. And we found that in the 10 years, essentially the 10 years since their study was published, that the number of roads in the Congo Basin has doubled again. So from 50,000 kilometers to now 100,000 kilometers of new roads in the next 10 years. Okay, that's been submitted, so that'll hopefully appear relatively soon. So the bottom line is, wow, the world's second largest rainforest area, incredible area of environmental importance and biodiversity, is changing at an incredible pace. We've seen things as a consequence of this kind of environmental change. For instance, an incredible slaughter of the world's forest elephants. And it's been a combination of these roads, which are just penetrating into all these forested areas where forest elephants survive, which is a different species than the savanna elephant. But also, of course, hunters now having much more, hunters and commercial hunters and subsistence hunters, but having much more lethal technologies. So they very commonly with automatic rifles, and also just wires and snares and cable are so ubiquitous now, cheap, and they're everywhere. And so really when you go along roads, you'll oftentimes find that just a few meters off the other side of the road are just whole sets of snares, and the hunters use roads to access these areas. And so we've seen in a period of about 10 years, about 2/3 of the world's forest elephants have been slaughtered. And there's very few places that are safe now in the Congo, and this is where they occur, is in Central Africa and the remnants of forests in West Africa, tiny populations there. There's been an incredible transformation of their populations. Now, they're just an iconic species. There's been many other species that have undergone major population declines, from apes to many other things, but it's sort of indicative of the kind of thing that's happening. Now, what I want to do is talk a bit about roads and make a bit of a distinction between direct environmental consequences and indirect environmental consequences. And, well, it'll become apparent for the reasons I'm doing that. When we talk about the direct environmental effects of roads, they can be pretty substantial. For instance, you can have habitat loss when you build a road. This is a road to a gold mine in central Panama. It's going through essentially old growth, essentially pristine forest. And you can see there's a few dozen meters of habitat that's loss and destruction that's associated with that road. So that's one direct impact of the road project or any kind of infrastructure project is going to be some habitat loss. A second thing that happens, especially in tropical environments, but I think in many other kinds of environments as well, is that when you juxtapose two kinds of environments that are physically very different. So you can imagine a tropical rainforest, which has a very specialized microclimate. It's very dark, it's very humid, the temperatures are buffered, and it's a unique ecosystem that's persisted for tens of millions of years, and many, many species have become specialized for those really quite unique microclimatic conditions. And then you juxtapose that with a road which is hot and harsh, has highly fluctuating temperatures, a lot of wind forces tend to build up, and you put those two physically dramatically different environments next to each other, and it's inevitable that you get a sort of a spillover of those environmental changes sort of forming a halo around the road itself. So I've been working for quite a long time. In fact, I think the first time I met Yadvinder was in the central Amazon, working quite a long time in a forest fragmentation project there. And this is some results from various people that have worked in this particular project, looking at all kinds of different of these so-called edge effects. So here, right here at 0, would be a road or would be a forest clearing of some sort, and then you can see the number of hundreds of meters that these different kinds of edge phenomena penetrate into the interior of the forest. And they're extremely eclectic, biotic and physical kinds of changes, but alterations in disturbance regimes and invasions of non-forest species and declines of forest interior species and just an incredibly complex and diverse set of different kinds of environmental phenomena. But the key point being that when you put in a road, you're not just changing a little strip of forest, you're actually altering substantial areas on either side of that. So the actual footprint can be quite a lot larger. Roadkill, of course, something we all know about. Some of the early studies had kind of, I think the assumption, if you follow that literature, has been that roadkill is probably not a hugely important cause of population decline and fragmentation, but I think some of the more recent studies suggest that when you get species that are vulnerable to roadkill and when road densities do start to increase, that in fact this can be an important, road-related mortality can be an important force in driving some species towards extinction. And there's certain kinds of species we know from their behavior and their ecology that tend to be really vulnerable to road-related mortality. And then barrier effects. I mean, this is just another example. This is some work from my wife's PhD in the Amazon, looking at the effects of roads on understory birds. And there's a number of guilds of quite highly specialized birds that live down in the dark, deep interior of the forest understory, and they mostly eat insects. But they're very different in terms of their life habits. And it turns out that there's some of these birds that are incredibly strongly affiliated with forests. In fact, not only that, they have an incredible association with their own particular territory. So rather than like migratory birds, which will move, long distances, these things spend their entire life on one fixed territory. And in fact, not only that, but many of them are actually monogamous for their entire life. They have one mate, and they have one territory, and that's it. And you can catch those birds, and what's quite striking is you can catch one of those birds, and turns out you can play a tape recording of their call, and they get very upset, and they come right up, and you can catch them with a mist net. You can put some bands on them or put a radio collar on them, and you can move them inside the forest kilometers away from their territory. And it's astonishing. They will be back. In fact, in the experiments they did, every single time they went back to their territory, every single time they replicated that experiment, every time within that day or the next day, they were back on their territory. So somehow they're finding their way home. And their motivation to go home is tremendous. Then you can take those same birds and you can move them across a 100-meter wide clearing, which would be about what you'd associate with, say, for instance, a major highway without additional deforestation. And for many of these species of birds, they will move up and down the forest clearing, and they will not go back. And these are radio-collared birds that they've been able to track, and then eventually they just disappear, but they don't make it back to their territory. So what this suggests is that for some of these very specialized forest-dependent, forest interior species, also things that are strictly arboreal, we know that even relatively small clearings, like those associated with a road or a highway, probably are enough to actually fragment their population. And one of the things we know from population biology is that there's a really big difference between a little bit of movement and no movement at all. Once you get to the point where you actually are completely stopping movement, that means you're stopping demographic movement, you're stopping gene flow, that really can contribute to population fragmentation and increase extinction probability. So again, for some specialized species, this kind of stuff is going on. So another thing to worry about. So in terms of the direct impacts of roads. Now, what I would actually argue is that in many contexts, it's not the direct impacts of roads, it's actually their indirect effects, which are considerably more important in many contexts. Now, one obvious one is the incursions of hunters. We see this just about everywhere we look in developing nations and in other contexts too, where a new road gets put into forest or some kind of remote area, and hunters just come flooding in. And commercial hunters or subsistence hunters, and again, the technologies tend to be much more lethal than they have been in the past. This is a forest elephant that we found in a national park up in the northern Congo, and this has absolutely the signature of a poaching of an elephant that's been poached, because its face had been hacked off. Okay, so that's what ivory poachers do. They chop off the face with machetes in order to get the roots of the tusks out. So this has been really the driving force behind the slaughter of forest elephants and other elephants has been the ivory trade. So that's an absolute dead certain that elephant was killed, probably shot with automatic weapons, but it was killed for its ivory tusks. No doubt about it at all. Deforestation is another thing. We've been looking at the Amazon basin and trying to understand the predictors of deforestation there for a while, and we find a very strong effect of roads on deforestation intensity. We did this study originally in 2002, and we can see here we found a strong association between how far you are away from roads, or in this case highways, and the amount of deforestation that occurs. But one of the things that we realized is that we were actually just using the legal road maps. And we realized that, to understand the actual effects of roads, we also need to take account of all those illegal roads. So we sat down and very painstakingly mapped, and there's no good maps of this. You actually have to do it yourself by hand using remote sensing imagery and literally by eye. There's no algorithm that'll do it. mapped out all those illegal roads, or I should say a colleague did. And what we found was that for every 1 kilometer of legal road, there were 3 kilometers on average of illegal roads. Okay, so there's a lot of illegal roads. And secondly, when you actually know where all the roads are, that you have this incredible relationship that turns out that 95% of all deforestation in the Amazon basin occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a legal or illegal road. Now that's an incredibly powerful predictive relationship. If you tell an environmental scientist that you can predict 95% of any kind of variable with one predictor, and you're getting that much intensity, I mean, that just says roads are overwhelming everything in terms of what's going on. If you want to know where deforestation is going to occur, if you want to manage deforestation, if you want to predict it, if you want to prevent it in the future, it's all about roads. It's all about where the roads occur. And so, you know, this really is an incredibly important thing. By the way, one of the things I was going to mention in terms of the dragging effects of projects is an interesting statistic. There was a study done recently in the Brazilian Amazon, and they looked at the 50 largest mining projects, and these are large-scale industrial mines in the Brazilian Amazon. And they looked at the direct impact of the mine in the actual lease area, and these are big mines with large, you know, in many cases open cut mines. They've got large overburden and large tailings and infrastructure and stuff associated within the lease area. And then they said, how much deforestation is being caused by that mining project itself? And then they looked at the roads that had been created in order to access the mine. And these were new roads that had been created, you know, in the Amazon forest. And they found 12 times as much deforestation associated with the roads that were built to access the mine as caused by the mine itself. Okay, so again, I think it reinforces this idea that it's these indirect effects, that the dragging effects of a lot of these projects. I mean, yes, the infrastructure projects are incredibly important in terms of their own environmental impacts, but the roads that they're creating the economic impetus for oftentimes are having much greater impacts even than the projects themselves. Greenhouse emissions, of course, is another cause. We know that the loss and destruction and fragmentation of tropical forests is probably responsible for something on the order of, I don't know, the admin would probably have better numbers than me, but perhaps 10, 12%, maybe 15% of all the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions right now, which is roughly comparable to what the global transportation sector produces. So a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there's a lot of infrastructure that's happening right now, and we could talk about, you know, many different nations are involved in various kinds of infrastructure initiatives and different geographic regions, and there's multinational initiatives. But really, overwhelmingly, the biggest, I mean, in every sense, the largest, and it's in some senses been sort of the 9,000-pound gorilla in the corner that people have been a little bit leery of talking about, has been this Belton Road initiative. Now, I'm sure you've heard about it, but to some degree, people haven't been sure, I think, in some sense, of what to think. And obviously, these are affecting, in most cases, developing nations. But this is truly an initiative of unprecedented size. Currently spanning at least 130 nations, I think 131 nations as of the latest count I've been able to come up with. There's a minimum of 7,000 infrastructure and extractive industry projects associated with this. And the numbers are loose in terms of how much total investment, but you hear figures on the order of $6 to $8 trillion of total commitment that would be required in order to bring forward all these projects. But as I'll emphasize in a bit, there's considerable uncertainty around levels of this. It looks like China's total net investment, if you look across the different sectors of their multilateral banks and their private banks and their corporate investments and other kinds of investments, some of the individual billionaires and things, that China's going to be putting about $1 trillion roughly into the Belton Road project. And this is one of the common misconceptions, is if we're talking about a total global investment of, let's say, $8 trillion, in fact, 7/8 of the money is not coming from China. It's coming from the rest of the planet. And so this would be the host nations, but it'll also be a whole panoply of different investors. And again, this would be private banks, multilateral banks, bilateral aid, corporations large and small, individual investors, and then increasingly what we're seeing is a lot of the financial sector, things like in mutual funds and insurance funds and superannuation funds like this are looking at infrastructure as an attractive investment class. So the bottom line is China's got some skin in the game, very substantial skin in the game, but the whole planet does too. I mean, we're all very much tied into this project, and it's not just in an environmental sense, it's very much in an economic sense. So we all have a big stake in this. This, by the way, is what $1 trillion look like. If you stack up $100 U.S. bills, you put 100 of those on top of each other, and it's about a centimeter tall. And then if you want to make $1 trillion, there's a person, and it's 2 meters tall, and it's about the size of looks like a football field there. So $1 trillion is a fair amount of money, and we're talking 8 of those. We are talking about a fairly significant amount of investment. Now, as this Belton Road project has been rolled out, there's been quite a lot of thought from China in terms of its philosophical roots, and one can talk about this quite a lot. But one of the things that's accompanied the Belton Road project has been really a large number of white papers and policy documents and other kinds of information around the environment, forwarding things such as green credits, a lot of information around social and environmental guidelines. It's been very much wrapped up and presented in sort of a sustainable philosophy. I think they use phrases such as green civilization. So there has been a lot of information that's been put out by China around this notion. I mean, Chinese are not naive, and they know that that would be one of the real issues of concern. So one of the things that I wanted to try to do was to ask, well, given that this is being presented and sold as essentially an environmentally and certainly economically and socially favorable initiative, how is this actually playing out on the ground? And I want to look at it through the prism of just one species and one particular example. And I think in some ways it's becoming a bit of an iconic example. And I'll just show you why here. So it used to be thought there's 7 species of great apes on the planet. Of those, 2 of them, it used to be thought were orangutans. Now, there was the Bornean orangutan and there was the Sumatran orangutan. In 2017, a new paper came out by Nader et al. And showed that, in fact, that this isolated population here was a completely different species, which is now called the Tapanuli orangutan. And every way you look at it, it's different. I mean, genetically, but also behaviorally, morphologically. Everything about it is distinctive. Its vocalizations, everything it does. And it turns out that the orangutans are the most arboreal of all the great apes, and the Tapanuli orangutan is the most arboreal of all the orangutans. In fact, in 3,000 hours of observation, it's never been seen on the ground. So that actually makes, in some sense, modeling the effect of land use change on it relatively straightforward. It's because literally you only see them on the ground when they're dead. So as you can see from a study that we did here, we looked last year in detail at its geographic range and the various kinds of land use changes that are happening and the fragmentation and other things that are happening. And one of the things that we found is that there's an absolutely striking association between roads and Tapanuli orangutans. In other words, where you get roads, you don't get Tapanuli orangutans. As a consequence of land use change, because they are strictly confined to forest cover, and also because of poaching. There's a significant amount of poaching. But when roads, and this happens in many places in the world, but when roads are created in areas, you very often get this sort of secondary effects of illegal encroachment, very common in places like Indonesia and elsewhere, where you get oil palm, small-scale mining activity, and other kinds of farming activity and poaching associated with these projects. So the Tapanuli orangutan has a highly fragmented habitat, and it really is extremely vulnerable. And I think I just mentioned here quickly, tiny geographic range, about 1/10 the size of Sydney, Australia. I mean, as species go, for a species of great ape, that's an incredibly small little postage stamp size of the world. Less than 800 individuals, according to the best available estimates, and overwhelmingly the world's rarest great ape. It's critically endangered, and as the IUCN goes, I mean, that is as bad as it gets. The next step is extinct. So it really is direly, desperately threatened. Now, when we've looked and assessed the various kinds of threats, there are a number of things going on, but it's pretty clear that the most immediate and important threat to the survival of the Tapanuli orangutan is a hydro project, the so-called Batang Toru hydro project. It's not actually a hydro dam per se, it's a more complicated project that involves constructing something that would be equivalent of a major leg of the Lunyon tube, having some water impoundment areas, but then a 10-meter pipeline that'll go under the ground and then come out to generating facilities, but there'll be substantial roadworks, 14 kilometers of roads, clearings for high-tension power lines, huge earthworks, and spoilage areas and other areas where you're going to have a lot of environmental change. Also, the river that goes through the middle of this project. Oh, sorry. So it's a, as things go, as these projects go, $1.6 billion. It's not trivial in terms of its funding, but it's not massive in terms of hydro projects. And it turns out when you actually calculate the costs and benefits to this, the kilowatt hours produced per dollar are among the lowest of any contemporary hydro project that's being developed right now. And I'll defer to Bent more discussion about that later. But it's definitely it's going right through the heart of the largest surviving population. It essentially will slash right through the center of the main population, and it's going to largely cut it in half. And then what's going to clearly also happen is as has always happened, is there are going to be secondary effects of forest encroachment and poaching. The other thing it's going to do, and it's almost entirely funded by Chinese financiers. There's a Sino-Hydro, which is China's national hydroelectric authority, is very integral and involved in this project, but there's also an Indonesian proponent, and as happens in Indonesia, it's a large corporation, very old money, and a politically powerful corporation, but they create a subsidiary called North Sumatra Hydro Energy, which is in charge of this project. So it's just the way things work in Indonesia. But if you look at the funding, it's essentially 100% funded by Bank of China and other Chinese funding sources, although anyway. Now, when this body of work came out, and when it became apparent that, this project was happening right smack in the heart of this critically endangered species of ape, I mean, from an environmental perspective, it's a little difficult to imagine a project that would be more galvanizing for the scientific and conservation communities, and that's exactly what we've seen. The group I lead, ALERT, Alliance of Leading Environmental Researchers and Thinkers, has been involved, but there's been many Indonesian and international scientists. Scientists have really played an active role in this issue, and then you've got various conservation NGOs, of which not all are listed here, but Friends of the Earth and their Indonesian affiliate WALI, which is actually the largest conservation NGO in Indonesia, Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, the Sumatran Orangutan Society, SOS, here in the UK. FAAAS started up a petition, and in 1 week they had 1.3 million signatures. Mighty Earth's been involved, and there's been a number of investigative reports now which have come out about this. I mean, it really has gained incredible momentum. And honestly, I mean, this is an integral part of the Belton Road. And one would think that if the Belton Road really were going to be developed in this sort of view of a green civilization and sustainability, this, if you could think of a single project, because this is the only place where this ape survives, is just this little valley here. This is going to be really transformed. And the other thing is, by the way, the flow of this river here is going to be stopped. In addition to the roads and the clearings for the high tension power lines and all the overburden and everything else happening, and the tunneling and all that, and some flooding, you'll essentially, if you're a poacher, you can just walk in up this river, because for 18 hours a day, it's essentially not going to have any flow at all. So you don't even need a road. You can just walk in along the riverbed. So that's how this project is going to function. But what has been interesting, I mean, if you watch how this played out, and I have and I don't use this phrase lightly, I have used the term, and I've been quoted a couple times in the media as criminal conspiracy. And that's the only way I could describe the incredible number of activities that have gone on. We don't have time now for me to describe everything, but I can tell you that the proponents, as some of the people from Greenpeace that I was having, and with SOS I was having lunch with today, started talking about this. But the number of different things that have happened, they have dug in. It's been shown that there's been major falsification of the environmental impact assessment. There have been incredible pressures put on different scientists. There's been bribery and payoffs happening all over the place. We've had journalists tell us from some of the biggest newspapers in this region, including the Jakarta Post and the South China Morning Post, that they've been pressured. I mean, off the record, just telling us, look, we're just being told not to write anything negative about this project. And what's also happened is initially it looked like there was a lot of momentum being built up very rapidly. Then the company, North Sumatra Hydro Energy, went out and hired a PR firm. And that's changed the game, and now they've hired a second PR firm. And the first one they hired specializes in corporate crisis management. And that's changed everything. But anyway, the bottom line is there hasn't been any kind of backing off of this project. There's been, if anything, an extremely dogged, aggressive digging in and pushing forward, and at all costs, no matter what, we're going ahead with this project. And in fact, the bulldozers are roaring away right now as we speak. So if this is an example of an environmentally sustainable project, I would hate to see an example of one that's not environmentally sustainable under the aegis of this ostensibly sustainable Belton Road initiative. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the Belton Road and some things about the way that it's evolved and the way that it's happening right now, and why I think it really is a unique entity. And I'm very well aware of the issues around stereotypes and that type of thing. And what I want to emphasize, of course, we're really talking here about the Chinese government. I have many close Chinese colleagues in China, and former Chinese student, and many good friends in China, and I visited China a number of times. But this is a government initiative, and it has tremendous momentum now. So one thing about the Belton Road Initiative, it's less organized than most people realize. I'll just sort of put that out there. You'd think you could go to a website and find out everything about the Belton Road. In fact, it's the websites and the information are not up to date. The Belton Road is changing constantly. It's evolving. The goalposts are changing. That's one thing you realize about it, is it's just changing very rapidly. One of the things that happened 14 months ago was the Belton Road was initially designed to follow the old Silk Road routes to link China with Europe, and also including South China and the Middle East and Africa. Well, and also including some sea routes as well, linking up primarily with Africa and parts of the Indian Ocean. As of 14 months ago, China also announced that included under the aegis of the Belton Road were all their projects and investments, including substantial increases in all of Latin America, Central and South America, in the Caribbean region, and in the Arctic. And this involves considerable construction of ports and infrastructure facilities designed to take advantage of the fact that the polar ice cap is that the sea lanes, because of global warming, are opening up for longer periods of time. So, and by the way, China is also, so this Belton Road initiative now, occupies every human-occupied part of the Earth now, in terms of the continents. And also China, by the way, is also the largest, by far the largest foreign investor in Antarctica. And it's pretty clear that China is going to make a large play towards some kind of, even though they're not a party of the Antarctic Treaty, but there's substantial mineral resources and fisheries and other types of things associated with the Antarctic region. So, very large footprint. Another big concern is that a lot of the projects that are under the aegis of the Belton Road are going to be big multinational projects, especially some of the large transportation corridors. They're going to cross multiple nations, multiple boundaries, and there's going to be varieties of different funders in there. And one of the things that happens when you see these kinds of projects play out, it's not clear at all. And oftentimes, who's in charge in terms of any kinds of environmental compliance, any kinds of environmental enforcement. One of the things that China does do consistently is that in their policies they devolve, when they talk about who's going to be in charge of environmental and social monitoring and enforcement and compliance, they absolutely devolve to the host nation. So they say basically, whether it's Brazil or Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo, that nation is in charge of doing the EIAs and is in charge of the compliance and the monitoring and essentially enforcing what's going on. So they're essentially washing their hands of the responsibility. While on the one hand selling this all is very environmentally sustainable, but also then essentially just passing the buck in terms of who's going to be involved. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification in that China has also funded, for instance, through the Chinese Academy of Sciences, various kinds of projects designed to look at strategic elements of the Belton Road. I have issues around some of that. I'm happy to talk about that later if somebody wants to. One of the key things that you look at when you look at Belton Road projects, especially those funded under the aegis of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a multilateral bank, is they're really looking at transformative projects. Now, they use transformative in a very positive sense. They're like, okay, there might be this whole big valley, this whole large expanse, and it's essentially undeveloped, but there's 5 kilometers of difficult topography. If we can just punch a road through that last 5 kilometers, or this 5 kilometers of difficult terrain, we can then open up this whole area for development. Now, they'll put that very much in a positive sense, but I look at that same kind of quote-unquote transformative project, and I also see a very substantial prospect for the kind of chaotic and unregulated activities that we see in many kinds of remote frontier areas. So that's another characteristic. And then another thing is that China's tolerance and its attitude as an investor, as a foreign investor, their approach to project risk, particularly financial risk, is just different than the way that other OECD and other nations have and investors operate. And China has very little foreign aid. Almost all of Chinese investment are loans. Okay, they have to be paid back. This is not aid. It's money that's being lent. But it might be associated with acquiring natural resources or land or agricultural goods or paying back interest-bearing loans. But the bottom line is it's not a gift. And for instance, if you talk to here, for instance, Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the International Monetary Fund, she's extremely concerned about the kinds of projects. China's essentially apolitical. They'll work with anybody, but the projects that they're approving and they're going ahead with, in many cases, are regarded as being too high risk for other kinds of traditional donors and lenders and financiers to support. And a good example would be this project with the Tapanuli Orangutan. Okay, they tried to get the World Bank Group and the International Finance Corporation to support it. And they took one look at that project and they just said, no way. In fact, we actually got the IFC to come out and we've got the quote from them because they normally will never say this. We got them to actually admit publicly that they are not going to they wouldn't touch this project because it was just regarded as just absolutely radioactive in terms of its environmental significance and the environmental importance of the project. So traditional financiers are often steering clear of many of the projects that China is supporting. And people like Christine Lagarde and others have talked about this notion of debt traps. I mean, essentially what this creates is a high-risk situation in which it appears that China has oftentimes other agendas. In fact, it's almost certain that they do. But there must be a broader set of geopolitical issues and motivations that are underlying some of these projects because the projects are so high risk. Now, one kind of classic example is this port. I can't remember the name of the port, but it's considered the most important geopolitical asset in Sri Lanka, and China has now taken over control for 99 years, taken over control of that port. So another thing about, incidentally, when people talk about China's growing militarization, they often talk about the South China Sea, but they're not actually aware that China's militarization and these kinds of things may well be playing into this to a degree. But it's actually spreading right into the South Pacific region, and it's spreading into the Indian Ocean, and it's spreading into Africa. And China's announced recently that they're going to be beefing up substantially their military resources and assets in Africa, largely to defend their investments there. So China's military footprint is definitely spreading, and this is certainly making some people nervous. So anyway, but that's been a characteristic of the Belton Road, has been a different approach to risk. If you look at the risk-reward profiles and the way that investors tend to try to approach projects, China's tolerance to risk has been much higher. Now, this has resulted sort of from a perfect storm within China. One of the things you have to say firstly about China is that it has an extremely, it's an authoritarian government, but it has a very closed media. And for instance, the World Journalists Association has ranked nations in terms of their journalistic openness, and out of 180 nations that were ranked, and this is the most recent ranking, China was ranked at 176, which is just about the absolute dead bottom. Okay, so China is not an open nation at all. And bad news about the Belton Road either gets actively filtered out by government censors, or you also see a great deal, and also the so-called Great Firewall, but you also see a lot of passive censorship happening. This is something that we've really noticed, is that things just don't get translated into Mandarin. And it's as though, the journalists just know they can't and shouldn't do that. So it's a very, very strong pattern. But the other thing that, by the way, going on here is that because the Belton Road is absolutely the signature initiative of President Xi Jinping, and effectively now, as you know, he's become China's, if he wishes, effectively China's leader for life. So he's consolidated power like really no leader since Mao. No one really wants to cross him. No one with any brain cells wants to do that. And one of the things that he's done is he's gotten the Belton Road inscribed in the central constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, which means it's essentially a crime to criticize it. Okay, so that has had an unbelievable chilling effect on dialogue within mainland China in every sense. And what you find is that the Chinese population is really incredibly indoctrinated about the Belton Road. I mean, it's presented as China's gift to the world. When they see things on the news, it's some leader in some developing country saying the Belton Road is the most wonderful thing, we're so happy to have it here, and they're just getting this constant stream of information. And they're, Chinese are proud, patriotic people, but they're not hearing, it's not like democratic societies where you're hearing both sides of an issue. They're getting a very slanted view of this. And China also, of course, has an aggressive kind of hostility to criticism, and people sometimes put it in the context of this face-saving thing. But it's also broader. I mean, they will oppose criticism both overtly but also subvertly. In terms of, there's lots of things that have been shown to be happening sort of behind the scenes. But anyway, according to President Xi, the Belton Road is going to be, he's used words like low carbon, sustainable, circular, again, green economy, green philosophy. These kinds of words have been thrown around very, very heavily. But again, I would argue that the record as it's playing out right now doesn't reflect those kinds of words at all, or at least the risks associated with that. Now, one thing you do have to emphasize is that there's not a clear consensus, and if you talk to people that are familiar with what's happening in Beijing about eco guidelines, it appears that some of the really large Chinese corporations, some of the ones that have substantial overseas assets, do want to have some environmental and social guidelines associated with the Belton Road. And the reason is that probably they're vulnerable to, if there was a major environmental problem or social problem, they could have their assets, their overseas assets, seized. But there are many, for every single large corporation, there are many, many smaller and medium-sized corporations, and it's clear that the smaller corporations just don't want any guidelines at all. And I would say that I don't think there's any way, and this is certainly consistent with the way China has operated up to this point, there's almost no way that China is going to push or leverage its domestic or its corporations operating overseas to have strong environmental and social controls. One key thing to remember is that when China had its going abroad program, going global program, that was in the early 1990s. Remember, China first opened up into sort of a form of capitalism, and then they had their going global program in the early 1990s. That was just after the Soviet Union collapsed. And all these top-down controlled Soviet economies collapsed. And the Chinese saw that. And they were profoundly influenced by that. And they just saw that, like, look, top-down control on these industries is not functioning well at all. So essentially what they did is they told their industries and their financiers, just go make a lot of money. I think it was it Mao that said, to become rich, to become wealthy is glorious. And so essentially that was the instruction that they were given. And it was just to go and become very wealthy and maximize your profits. Yeah, and I already talked about the fact that laws or enforcement are devolved to host nations. And then you have to bring into this also Chinese sort of corporate culture. Chinese corporations, and there's a reason why you see very few Chinese large corporations listed on the international stock exchanges, is because they don't have the same standards of transparency that are required in order to be a member of those exchanges. So, you know, where they're spending their money, how much investments they've got, what kind of capital they've got, who's being paid, you know, who's being paid what. That information is just not there, and it really never has been. There's a few examples, exceptions to that, but that's the pattern. Has been, and also has to do with Chinese financiers as well. The banks and other kinds of lenders also tend to be, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's different, but the other, many of the institutions have just tended to operate in the shadows, in the darkness. And so, and I think this is a very telling quote from Transparency International, which, as you know, is the German NGO that monitors corruption around the world, and they have a good reputation. They said there's no investigations or charges have ever been laid in China against its companies, citizens, or residents for foreign corrupt practices. I mean, that's an incredible statement if you think about it. And I mean, to me, you know, that says bribe away, it's okay. And I've spent almost 40 years now working in developing countries in Latin America and the Asia Pacific and in Africa. And I have to say, Chinese entrepreneurs and financiers operate in a different way. And I don't have time to talk about this now, but there's a certain set of behaviors which seem to be different and more aggressive and more blatant than what you see in other types of investors. Yeah, sorry, lost my train of thought there. But anyway, the bottom line is it's a dangerous circumstance, and I think it's one that really sets up the potential for substantial abuse of the system. So we're living in this era of this modern infrastructure tsunami, and what are some of the things that we can do? I'd like to sort of finish up by talking about some of the issues and some of the potential solutions for this kind of thing. I mean, obviously, very powerful forces are afoot. We're caught in the midst of this. We're interested in these issues. We would like to have some influence. So what are the things that we can talk about? One of the things I think we need to talk about broadly, and this is sort of a set of strategic arguments, is that I think that in a lot of infrastructure projects, and I know Ben Flyberg would certainly agree, there are oftentimes exaggerated economic benefits. If you look at what's being proposed by the proponents and what's being suggested, you will see that the benefits that are being promised or being put out there are oftentimes very substantially exaggerated. And if you look at the literature on this, and we tried to do a literature review insofar as possible, what you see is that, and especially in terms of their benefits for poor people, but more generally, that project benefits tend to be really intensely variable and highly context dependent. So there is not a single rule of thumb or pattern that one can easily identify. And another thing is that one of the striking things is that many of these big infrastructure projects have highly inequitable benefits. So a classical pattern is that there'll be some decision makers within a country will certainly be enriched because there'll be inducements that'll be handed to them. You'll have some land developers, you'll have some other proponents that will certainly capture significant amounts of wealth. But if you look at that long tail of the population, which will be people living at poverty or near poverty levels, oftentimes they are capturing very little of the economic benefits. There might be some additional employment, but in fact, many people, in fact, don't gain much at all. And in some cases, they're falling behind because these projects can actually increase inflation. And so their costs of living, their living costs, rent costs, food costs, all that's going up, and they're not benefiting either. There's also, I mean, we could go on and on about some of these risks that happen. There's so-called Dutch disease, where you basically get, when you can get large foreign investments coming in around a particular, say, mining or oil and gas sector of the economy, that can destabilize the economy. It can reduce the diversity and the stability of the economy. And because of changes in the inflation, you tend to make other sectors of the economy less competitive. There's all kinds of potentially risky effects that can happen with some of these large, aggressive infrastructure investments and other kinds of extractive industry investments. There's just such a profound influence of corruption on these projects. I mean, so many projects that should never get approved are getting approved. I mean, if you look at them, if you're able to look at them in a transparent cost-benefit framework and any kind of rational framework, it's just apparent that things that should never get the thumbs up are getting that. Again, I'll defer to Bent to talk about some of the specific mechanisms here. And another thing that's happening is that the developers and the contractors and the cartels that are involved in constructing these projects are also themselves often siphoning off a lot of the funds. In fact, the World Bank estimates that 15 to 60% of the project funding for large infrastructure projects that they've supported are being siphoned off for cartels, by cartels and corruption. And their projects are probably better on average than typical. So, I mean, that's kind of a scary statistic, but because what it suggests is that when let's say you're building a road, a common thing that would happen is, let's say, to have that road to be viable and to be an asset that's going to last and maintain over time, maybe you need 60 centimeters of road base, and that's in the contract. Well, the contractor just puts in 20 or 30 centimeters of road base and he pockets the difference. Okay, so this is a very common thing that happens, and so that asset becomes a stranded asset, or it has a high risk of that. So stolen revenues is another thing that's happening very oftentimes when we're seeing this kind of frontier development in many places. For instance, Indonesia is losing lots of money as a consequence of essentially outright theft of timber. For years in the Brazilian Amazon, even the Brazilian government was suggesting that 80% of all the timber coming out of the Amazon was stolen, effectively, without any payment of royalties or taxation. Carnegie and Stanford University suggested the number was more like 90 to 95%. But bottom line, lots of money associated with timber industry. Malaysia right now, Malaysia was a key element of the Belton Road, and Malaysia has just shut down all of their Belton Road projects. They just washed their hand of it. And it turned out that former President, Prime Minister Najib had this 1MDB entity that he'd set up, and they initially thought that they'd siphoned off something like $1 billion, and now is looking more like $5 billion was siphoned off substantially from Belton Road funds, but from other sources as well. But now a whole series of high-speed railways and other projects and pipeline projects have now been shut down. This has been a major blow to China. But it's been partly because the projects have just not proceeded. And one of the reasons that they've not proceeded is because there's been so much money that's been, this has all ended up in overseas bank accounts. And Leonardo DiCaprio, I don't care about Paris Hilton, whatever happens to her, but Leonardo DiCaprio was a really good guy, and even he's gotten sucked into this, poor thing. So anyway, bottom line is it's a gigantic mess, and it's just indicative, I think, of some of the risks that can happen. One of the points I really want to make as environmental scientists and people that care about sustainable development, we oftentimes tend to talk about biodiversity issues and environmental issues, but I would really like to make an argument very forcefully that these risks and these kinds of issues are intensely interrelated. They're like two octopuses wrestling with one another. So for instance, if we look at the haze issue, which has plagued Southeast Asia for many years in the dry season and during El Nino years, you get intense haze, you've had large-scale closures of schools, you've had airports being closed, you've had major increases in respiratory distress, Harvard and Columbia University came out with an epidemiological study that suggested that more than 100,000 people per year were suffering premature mortality as a result of this recurring haze issue. But that's an environmental issue, but look, that is an economic issue, and that is a social issue, and that's a political issue, and it's a reputational issue, okay? These tentacles are intensely intertwined, and when we're talking about risks of projects, and we're talking about, why and when nations need to think about these issues, we don't want to just talk about, say, biodiversity. And we've been lucky to have pretty good access to ministries, in some cases prime ministers in different nations where we're working. Elephants and orangutans get you about 5 minutes, okay? After that, you better be ready to talk about things like, we talk about money and we talk about votes. We actually devolve everything right down into votes. And it's amazing how these kind of glazed eyes all of a sudden just focus, and you've got their attention when you start talking about votes and staying in office. So another example, water quality. These are issues that really tend to resonate. Deforestation has huge impacts on the production and supply, consistency of water, the quality of water, impacts on fisheries, that type of thing. So these are, again, issues that are associated with the things that are impacting what we care about, say, for instance, in terms of biodiversity or environmental quality, but they're also economic issues and social issues, and they cost money to resolve. One of the things that's not being factored at all into a lot of these projects, and I really noticed this with road construction projects, is the very high level of maintenance costs, especially for road construction, but also things like mining projects in high rainfall environments. And this is something we're seeing trillions of dollars now in being spent in tropical, high rainfall environments, and in which there's just nowhere near enough money being set aside and planned for the maintenance of those projects. So you might see, tens of millions of dollars being put into major highway networks. And for instance, we've estimated 10 to 20% per year. The World Bank estimates, at least in parts of Indonesia, that 20% per year of the total capital investment. So let's say you spend $10 million on a highway. They're estimating that 20% of that investment needs to be invested each year in order to maintain that highway and keep it operating. Okay, so that's then $2 million a year on top of that $10 million. And what we're seeing is in developing nations, these incredible schemes for opening up huge frontier areas with all these gigantic road networks ramifying all over the place. But in many cases, there's not the investments in maintenance. And so you see these assets being squandered. And a lot of these projects are designed to get agricultural goods or in minerals or other things to export markets or to cities. And they're designed, to basically be able to drive 80 or 100 kilometers per hour. In fact, what you see is that people drive about 10 or 15 kilometers an hour because they keep hitting these places where there's potholes, or because you get all this subsurface flow, you get slumping of the surface and the road cracks, just like there's been an earthquake. And so traffic just keeps bottlenecking. I mean, I've seen crazy places in different parts of the tropics. So bottom line is, this is not being factored into the thinking. And one of the things that we're really arguing is that developing nations need, ideally, and it's in their interest to think considerably more conservatively about which projects they support, and to support those projects that are really going to give them long-term benefits and are not going to result in surprises and stranded assets and environmental crises and other kinds of long-term costs that they can incur. Now, another thing that's happening on top of all this is that we're starting to see some macroeconomic effects happening in China. And in particular, we know that China's had this very high tolerance of risk in many of the projects that they've proposed or are undertaking. This creates, of course, a high risk of default for the host nations, which is something the host nation doesn't want to have happen. But also, I mean, look here. Here's China's gross foreign debt, and here's China's foreign debt to GDP ratio. These are the kinds of things that economists tend to look at. And this was between 2009 and 2017, which is the most recent data I can find. Look at how much this has grown. Now, these numbers are, by the standards of some nations, are not that high, but what's striking about China is the fact that they've escalated so rapidly that such a high proportion of them are associated with potentially bad, high-risk projects that could default, and also that many people believe that they're probably only understating probably by half what the actual debt may be. In fact, if you look at all the sources of debt. So the bottom line is this: what happened? What caused the global financial crisis? It was the U.S. basically supporting high-risk housing loans, okay, that defaulted. That's almost exactly what's happening in an analogous sense here. Is huge amounts, the world's second largest economy, which may soon be the world's largest economy, is now having a gigantic escalation of its debt, much of it associated with high-risk situations. So this is why I'm saying the whole world has a stake in this. This could potentially start another GFC. So we all have a hand in what's going on. So let's finish up by saying, how can we help biodiversity? What are some of the things that we can do here? Which, we spend a lot of time talking about trying to green infrastructure. People talk about this a lot. How can you make infrastructure greener, more compatible with environmental and biodiversity and other kinds of issues? And I want to just talk quickly about some principles here. So one of the things that you tend to see when you see projects advancing, I don't know how many examples you can think of, but when you see an environmental impact assessment study, how many times do you actually see the EIA say, no, the project shouldn't go ahead? I mean, they should stop. And someone the other day said they could not, I can't remember who it was a very, very experienced person, said they couldn't think of a single example. I could only think of one. But this is just not what happens with EIAs, okay? What the EIAs tend to do is they tend to say, okay, well, we'll have a fish ladder, or we'll have a wildlife overpass, or we'll do some kind of mitigation measure. Maybe there'll be an offset if we can't, but the bottom line is we're going to do something, and that's going to make us feel better, and we're doing something. It's better than not doing anything at all, and then the project will just go ahead. Fish ladders, by the way, I saw one meta-analysis that suggested that fish ladders, on average, turns out that different kinds of fish need different kinds of fish ladders, but on average, they have about a 3% success rate. So for migratory fish, only about 3% are getting past each dam. You don't need very many dams to completely wipe out an anadromous or migratory fish runs under those circumstances. So the bottom line is, a lot of these kinds of mitigation measures, they're expensive, they're kind of boutique things. They tend to have, the available evidence suggests that they tend to have oftentimes limited effectiveness, and they don't address the critical secondary impacts at all. And I sort of say, it's a bit like treating cancer with a Band-Aid in a lot of cases. An example of this, one of my PhD students studied in peninsular Malaysia. They created 17 so-called wildlife, they call them eco-viaducts, but they were just overpasses that were part of the road construction project. But their idea was that these were going to be avenues that were going to allow wildlife to cross these highways unimpeded, supposedly. And so my student evaluated this using camera traps and that type of thing. And one of the things they really were keen, because they had problems with elephants being struck with vehicles, and it was a high-profile issue, they really wanted the elephants to use these underpasses beneath the highway. So in addition to having them, they also strung up very powerful electric fences along the roads so that the elephants would be funneled into these overpasses. Well, it turns out that the elephants, when they encounter these fences, tend to do one of two things. One, and the elephants are very smart. One is they'll just knock a tree over, and then they'll just break the fence that way, or they'll just come up to their buddy and knock their buddy into the electric fence, and then they can get over it that way. But it turns out, where the elephant wants to cross the road, the elephant's going to cross the road. And it doesn't matter where you put the eco-viaducts, and a lot of wildlife are like that. So we can create these overpasses and underpasses and rope bridges and all that stuff, but the thing is, the efficacy of these things is oftentimes really limited. And really this exercise has shown this. So one of the things I would argue when we're talking about greening infrastructure, one of the things that we need to talk about much, much more than we are right now is screening, calling out, identifying, and actually stopping a lot of the projects. Now, of course, we're dealing with sovereign nations, and again, we as scientists aren't, we're not in the position to make those decisions, but we can provide information, and we can help developing nations to make much better and more informed decisions about these kinds of things. And it turns out that when you just start using transparent criteria, that using data sets that anybody can access, that anybody can understand, a lot of these projects quickly look like they're not going to be very economically viable. These are 33 major development corridors. A lot of these are associated with mining investments. Substantially Chinese funding, but other foreign funders as well. But they're being sold as helping to solve Africa's food security crisis because they're going to open up a lot of areas for new agricultural development. It turns out that when you actually look at these in terms of their viability, only 6 out of the 33 look like they'll probably be a good idea. It turns out that when you're in, a lot of these are in really remote areas with largely natural environments and very few people. Turns out one of the reasons why that is they also occur in places that don't have good soils and have climates that are not very amenable for agriculture, or they're so far from markets, that type of thing. But bottom line is, this is just very simple analysis using information that anybody could find, and that kind of analysis suggests that we can use that as a tool, I think, to identify a lot of the projects that are probably not a very good idea. We really need to have more strategic planning. Right now what we're doing, nature is dying a death of 1,000 cuts. And what we do with our environmental impact assessment is we go in and we say, okay, we're going to look at that one little cut in isolation from everything else. So we're going to say, what's the impact of that one little cut? Well, the reality for nature is it's the combined effect of all of those environmental insults happening simultaneously. So what's a kind of a strategic approach, of which there's different kinds of strategic approaches, what the strategic approaches do is try to look at all of those different projects together and to do sort of more of a land zoning approach to try to identify areas that are be hot spots for conservation and, say, prime areas for development. And we think that there's a great deal of opportunities for optimizing development in a much smarter way than what's happening right now. It's clear that we can oftentimes proactively identify most of the destructive projects or most of the high-risk projects. We know enough right now. We could just simply look at a map and we can look at some basic characteristics of the projects. We know enough right now where we can go through and we can just, with a red pen, we can just tick off projects that are probably going to be really high risk and really dangerous, and we could literally just focus on the ones that are pocked with red marks and identify those. This, by the way, are road networks within the Brazilian Amazon, and some of those projects have just been nightmarish. One of the things that we see, if there's perhaps a single principle of a take-home message here, one thing is I'd say, we need to build a broad church. We need to be talking about all these different kinds of risks together. We need to be talking about stopping projects, not just kind of tweaking them with little environmental changes. And also, we know some really important principles. For instance, deforestation is intensely spatially contagious. Okay, so what we know is that if you put a road into a forested area, essentially deforestation is going to grow along that road essentially like a series of tumors. Okay, it behaves very much like cancer. So you get a series of tumor-like deforestation areas occurring along that road, and then you tend to get secondary roads and tertiary roads coming off of that, and essentially the cancer spreads. And it metastasizes and it spreads all over the landscape. The strategy, the smart strategy for staying healthy is not to get cancer in the first place, okay? So the point is to governments, if you're going to put in a road like that, you really need to be prepared for one of two realities. Reality one is that you're either up for a long-term investment, year after year, of monitoring and compliance, and you need to have a proper judiciary, and you basically need to be able to monitor those activities if you want to control the frontier activities. Or you will, in many cases, have sort of a chaotic situation in which governments are being ripped off and populations are being ripped off, in which there's a lot of illegal and illicit activities going on. So stopping that first cut, we know, is really overwhelmingly the most efficient strategy that we can do. We want to do things like keep the core areas and protected areas road free. So we want to have protected areas. We need to have roads for ecotourism and that type of thing. But ideally what we want to do is to have roads going to some beautiful vistas and scenic waterfalls and that type of thing. But we want to have large core areas of those protected areas free of roads whenever we possibly can, because we just know that there's certain kinds of species that can't survive without that. And I think really the bottom line is this: whenever we possibly can, the best thing we can do with these in the onslaught of these projects is just try to slow things down. Just try to delay things as much as possible, because what that does then is it provides an opportunity for information to be divulged to the general public, and for the general public of those host nations to then have debates and have informed discussion and discourses about what's actually going on. Because what you see right now is the developers are just trying to railroad projects through as rapidly through the approvals process as they possibly can. There's a lot of PR and propaganda that are going out. And once the public actually understands what the real risks and realities are, you will find that many of these projects will actually die on their own. And another thing that we know is that a lot of the projects, big infrastructure projects, do have quite high failure rates. And if you can slow them down, the proponents behind them are governments that are being elected at biannual intervals, corporations that are operating on quarterly and annual profit statements. I mean, these are entities that need to push these projects ahead very, very rapidly. So if we can just slow the projects down, there's absolutely not a hint of anything that's in the least bit undemocratic and not in the interest of the host nations and their populations in this kind of approach. It's basically saying to them, you want to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs. And it turns out that these kinds of strategies actually end up having lots of environmental benefits in addition to reducing the long-term effects. So I would argue that this kind of approach, this kind of divulge, debate, and delay as much as we possibly can is one of the best things we can do to try to promote a more sustainable future in the face of this tremendous onslaught of infrastructure globally. So, thank you.